Krzysztof Zieba, game designer from the indie developer Draw Distance, project lead of games Vampire the Masquerade, Coteries of New York, and co-producer of Vampires the Masquerade, Shadows of New York. And today he will tell us a story how an indie studio from Poland ended up making not one but two games on the Vampire or the Masquerade license.
Hi, everybody. So, the way I was introduced, I'm Krzysztof Zięba, and here is the story of how we Draw Distance created those games that were mentioned. Let's start with the fact that I'll be taking questions after the whole talk is over, and hopefully I'll leave you guys enough time to ask anything you'd like to know. So let's get this started with a little bit of history behind Draw Distance. We were known as Ivan for All from 2009 to 2019. We've recently fully migrated into our new name, Draw Distance. We used to be mostly a mobile company, mostly creating mobile games until 2016. And since then, we've been making indie games aimed at all major platforms, meaning PC, Xbox, PS, and Switch. So the games you might know us from is Serial Cleaner. That's our breakout hit from 2017. It was a top-down dexterity game with a big stealth component set in the 1970s. We did Halls of Horror, which was a Mixer exclusive, Mixer being the Microsoft streaming platform, Last Man Standing kind of tabletop-y game, and it's going to become relevant in a while. Ritual Crown of Horns, which was our top-down Weird West shooter. The two games I'm going to discuss today, Coteries of New York and Shadows of New York, both visual novels, with Shadows of New York being a standalone expansion to Coteries. And we're currently working on Serial Cleaners, the sequel to Serial Cleaners set in the 1990s. As for me, I'm a designer and writer. As was already mentioned, I've started my work in game development in 2011, and I've been with Ivan for All and Draw Distance since 2016, basically at the cusp of the company changing its focus from mobile games to indie games. A humble brag here, I'm also the author of the board game In the Name of Odin that was published in 2016. All right, so for those of you who don't know, let's quickly recap what Vampire the Masquerade is all about. It's a setting. It's a setting for mostly tabletop games. That's how it started out, and currently it is being, pitched as a big IP for video games as well. And the crux of Vampire the Masquerade is that the idea is vampires and other supernatural creatures are real and have been hiding among humanity since the dawn of time. That's the titular masquerade in case of the vampires. Every creature of this kind hides from humanity, but vampires became very adept at it. The idea behind World of Darkness, which is this overarching IP that encompasses Vampire the Masquerade and other IPs, is the setting is that it's set in modern times and it focuses on realism. The World of Darkness is basically here and now, and there's this approach of trying to use HBO storytelling, which means there's going to be violence, there's going to be sex, there's going to be we want to shy away from mature topics. The struggle to maintain your own humanity and the temptations of the beast is another big element of Vampire the Masquerade. The beast is basically this kind of dark passenger that every vampire has that pushes the vampire to feed at any cost. But obviously, if you want to maintain your humanity, if you want to remain closer to human than a monster, then you need to quell that. And how different vampires deal with that is part of their story. There's a rich mythology, which we won't be getting into since neither of our games in particular deal with that. But there are many biblical elements to it. There's a complex social and political structure. And this is something that our games do focus on. The Camarilla and the Anarchs are two so-called sects that both have their different ways of dealing with their members and different structures, etc. And finally, there are 13 clans of vampires. Each has their own unique traits and access to different powers. Those powers are called disciplines, and it's a staple of the game that each of these clans is very archetypical, and fans of different clans will tell you why they like them over any other clan. Like I mentioned, the timeline would be that we get our start in the early 90s. That's when White Wolf Publishing, a company focused on RPGs, on pencil and paper RPGs, starts off with Vampire in the very early 90s. Then Vampire is followed by other elements of the World of Darkness, such as Werewolf, Mage, and Wraith. Those are the most well-known ones, but there's a bunch of other ones that have been also expanded upon and made expansions in the World of Darkness. This is a still from a TV series that Vampire had called Kindred the Embraced. They did that in the 90s. Believe it was produced by Aaron Spelling, so it was probably the first attempt to branch into other mediums. And then obviously the two things that most people in our industry are going to know Vampire the Masquerade from are two games released on the PC. The first one in, I believe, the year 2000, Vampire the Masquerade Redemption, and then Bloodlines in 2004, which is obviously the one that's most well known. In the meantime, after that period of time, after those two games were released, there were also plans for creating a World of Darkness MMO, and CCP, the company CCP, was behind that, but that didn't come to fruition. And then Paradox Interactive stepped in. Paradox Interactive bought out White Wolf and acquired it basically from CCP. And since Paradox has been at the helm, the RPG has been given a 5th edition, the tabletop RPG, and Bloodlines 2 was obviously also announced and is being worked on, along with many other World of Darkness projects such as Swansong or Earthblood, and other titles, and also our titles. So how did we get here? Well, as I mentioned before, the story has something to do with Mixer, Microsoft's streaming platform, which is now defunct. But we did Halls of Horror with Microsoft. It was a game we created specifically for the Mixer platform. That was in, I believe, 2018, late 2018. And the idea was that during one of the business company meetings that our business developer had, I believe somewhere in the US, our business developer Jacek met with the person who was at that time the head of White Wolf. And basically, since Jacek was a fan of Vampire the Masquerade and the World of Darkness as well, he kind of jumped on the occasion to talk to White Wolf. And the idea was that we might be able to pitch White Wolf and Paradox, or at that time still White Wolf, pitch them an idea for a game set in Vampire the Masquerade in collaboration with Microsoft's Mixer platform. So basically create a Mixer exclusive game set in the Vampire the Masquerade universe. As with most games that tried to do that, one big inspiration initially was Shiny Shoes. What was the name of the game? Oh man, I forget. Shiny Shoe did a game for Mixer that was basically a choose your own adventure game where people would vote. Everybody who watched the stream could vote on what the character should do. Death's Door was the name of the game, and they later also did a revamp of that called Death's Door Aftermath. And those two games were big inspirations for us, and we wanted to do something similar, but set in the Vampire the Masquerade universe. That didn't quite come to pass. There were some changes in White Wolf, and we kind of lost contact with them for a while. But then when we re-established contact, when it was clear that Microsoft would be, it wasn't clear back then that they would shut the platform down, but it was clear that they weren't interested in creating any more of these Mixer exclusive games. And even Halls of Horror only lasted until, I believe, February or March of 2019, when it was shut down by Microsoft, not by us. So we approached White Wolf with another idea. So maybe we could do a similar game with decisions and with a lot of text, etc., but basically a single player game. And that's how the original proof of concept demo was created. We did that in March of 2019, and well, March and April 2019. And this is how the game looked in that proof of concept demo. You might note that those of you who played Coteries of New York or even Shadows of New York might recognize two of the characters here, Hope and Tameka, who have survived from those early days, though in a much changed way, but they did survive to the final game. And basically, White Wolf really liked, at that time, Paradox already kind of took White Wolf under their wing, so we were talking officially with Paradox, and Paradox really liked what we were proposing here. The first impressions after the demo in May, when we decided that we'd be doing this full game, was that we were clearly comfortable with the license, but some details and some of our understanding of the game's world had to be ironed out a bit. And we almost immediately realized that if we were to create the game in the small amount of time that we had to cut the scope. I had a pretty tense call with Paradox when I wasn't really sure how they would react to that, but they proved to be very amicable and very understanding. And we basically decided to not have 7 playable clans, but only 3 playable clans. And that was the biggest change that we made to the scope. And also we decided to not go very hard on the mechanics side of things, so we don't get bogged down in systems and in balancing, etc. We wanted to focus on storytelling. And it was an optimistic start to the project, honestly. It was, I call it a honeymoon period, basically 2 to 3 months, depending on how you count them, of mostly feeling like we have this under control and we mostly know what we're doing. We have a good understanding of the IP. We started, bouncing off ideas for the story, etc. So that was all a very nice and optimistic start. The second big milestone was PDXCon, the convention that Paradox held in Berlin in October of last year. That was the first time when we would be showing the game to the public. We had a demo ready for the Nintendo Switch and PCs, and we were eager to show it to people and get first impressions, and their first impressions were pretty good. We had lots of positive feedback from it, from that event, even though the event itself wasn't really focused on us. It was mostly a celebration of Paradox as a company, and the result of which was that we basically got the most action out of Saturday, out of the 19th of October, and then the 18th of October and 20th of October, people were on that convention for different reasons, and it wasn't necessarily our game. So it did come at a time when we were, frantically finishing up other stuff. So it wasn't a waste of time, but we felt like perhaps we could have done some additional work in that period. But it was a weekend, and we didn't work weekends yet at that point. Though the rest of the year is kind of a blur to me, because what ended up happening is a lot of different smaller delays and a lot of different production problems meant that we had to keep making the size of the game a bit smaller, and basically we had to work overtime to get it to release on December 11th. Originally, we were hoping to release the game on at least 2 platforms, at least PC and Switch, but we quickly found that we just cannot find the time to create a port of the game. So we focused on PC, we focused on Steam and GOG, and the game officially released on December 11th. I will now attempt to show you the trailer for the game.
New York City. 8 million people live here. Can you imagine? They commute, work, party, live their lives in one of the biggest, busiest cities in the world. And yet, they have no idea who it is they're sharing their nights with. How could they? We are apex predators. We have had centuries to become adept at our little masquerade. Navigating this veritable sea of mortals is only part of the puzzle, though. We have our own kindred to deal with, too. Others who crave the same things we do. Influence, power, blood. All are plentiful here, but none are without a cost. You will need to forge alliances. You might have to make more than a few enemies. And through all that, you must do what it takes to slake your ever-present hunger. Prove you can handle all this, and you might just find your place in this city. Indeed, for our kind, the Big Apple is ripe with opportunities. All you need is dare to take a bite.
So as you can see, we've basically positioned the game as a narrative experience because we were kind of shying away from the visual novel label with Coteries, which might have been a mistake since it really was, like, for all intents and purposes, it was built as a visual novel. The reason I was initially unsure about using that label was that I started building the game as something more complex, and only as we had to, cut down the scope of the game, we ended up with something that had a little bit less of a light RPG vibe, which I was hoping to convey, and was more linear and more focused on, like, rather narrow paths through the narrative. But people seem to like it. Initially, we had mixed reviews on Steam, between mixed and mostly positive reviews. We were hoping to be mostly positive, but the game's release state wasn't very great, and so we knew two things after that. The game sold very well from our perspective, so we knew that we needed to polish up Coteries, and also we knew that we wanted to follow up the game with something. Initially, we were thinking about several smaller DLC packs focused on the companions, on the characters that the breakout characters from Coteries. But because the production was moved to another person, the creative vision sort of for those DLC packs was moved to another creative overlord. We kind of changed our idea behind that, and I'll tell you about it in a minute when we discuss Shadows of New York. But for Coteries, we had a lot on our hands for post-launch, basically until the release of the PS4 and Xbox versions, which basically came in March, and then Xbox in April. We were hard at work to add additional art into the game, to polish up the bugs, to finish up, to kind of polish the sound design, which was also lacking in the version that was published initially. And obviously, like, the Nintendo Switch was also a big goal of ours. We also decided that we would call that version Director's Cut and basically give a free update to anybody who already bought the game at that time. That's all the improvements that I've made, and all the additional portraits and locations that we've added was part of that Director's Cut. And then we also had a collector's edition, a digital collector's edition, which included an art book and a digital soundtrack. So that's also something that we really would have wanted on release, but because of different issues, we couldn't quite make that. So we decided that we would make the game available on other consoles while creating an update called the Director's Cut, basically. And by the way, the game is now sitting, I believe, at mostly positive, and it's after we've made another update to it a few months ago, as Shadows of New York was also released. The game, I think, is getting quite stable reviews, and basically people are only still upset that it's not a full-fledged RPG, but, well, in that way it is what it is. But otherwise, we managed to use that time well to polish up also all sorts of different smaller and bigger problems with the game. And so as I was doing that, as I was focusing on pushing that collector's edition and creating content for the collector's edition and pushing that director's cut. One of the writers for Coteries of New York, Aleksander Borszowski, was given the control over the standalone expansion. He had a very good idea for it, better than any of my ideas for those small standalone pieces of DLC was. So he ended up starting working on Shadows of New York. While I was basically a vision holder and producer and game designer and level designer and writer and etc. on Coteries, on Shadows of New York, I was only in charge of the production and implementation, basically. So the writing credit is almost entirely cross Aleksander Borszowski, with some additional writers contributing to some side content. Whereas in Coteries, we used I believe, four writers in total. Me, Cross, another friend of ours from Bluebird team, Andrzej Mądrzak, and Finnish writer Johanna Persson, who also did some work for the tabletop role-playing game, the Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition core books, source books, I believe. So the idea for Shadows of New York was that we would be making standalone expansion. So we wanted it to be to a point, not entirely independent, but as independent as it could be from Coteries of New York. But at the same time, we wanted it to close up some of the threads that were left dangling at the end of Coteries and throw in a little bit of more of a status quo. Because one thing that we really appreciated was that anything we did with the New York of the World of Darkness would be written into canon in one way or another, right? So we were basically co-creating this universe with many other authors. So we were very aware that any decisions that we make are going to have like long-term lore consequences. And so with Shadows, we've decided that because Chicago by Night was a fresh source book then, and that's a source book in which one of the fan favorite clans, the La Sombra, were introduced, that we might have a La Sombra playable character, which would be a first for the franchise in terms of video games. Unofficially, there were mods for, I believe, both for Redemption and Bloodlines that allowed you to play La Sombra, but there wasn't an official game in which you could do that. And so Cross's idea was to take that clan because of its kind of both its looks and the way that it was currently kind of usually the La Sombra were enemies of the Camarilla, enemies of one of the big organizations, but they recently joined the game's lore. The Camarilla agreed that La Sombra could join, and so that was an interesting political situation that we could also try and use in the game. And so our main character, Julia, became that kind of low-level clerk, basically, for the Camarilla, which allowed her to have a good position that the story could take off from. In Coteries, we had three playable characters, as I mentioned, and each of them had some small differences in how they play. Basically, the beginning of the game is quite different for each of them, and the disciplines that they have make some elements of the game a bit different. But for Shadows, we knew that we wanted to focus on a single playable character, give her more of a voice. The characters from Coteries were written sort of open so that you could potentially project yourself onto them, but at the same time they had enough characteristics of their own that it was kind of difficult to treat them as just blank slates. And there wasn't any customization or anything like that. So on Shadows, we decided, you know what, let's just have a single playable character. That playable character is going to have a strong voice of her own and her own story to tell. One thing that we were very happy with was that we managed to work with a composer named Rezina. She's a cellist, a Polish cellist, who creates these very very thematic landscapes, and she was a perfect fit for Shadows of New York. Working with her also made this beautiful vinyl record possible, which is a recent development. The soundtrack of Coteries of New York was also great. It was very well received by people, by fans. But we wanted to try something different, so that even the kind of soundscape of this separate game is going to be different than in Coteries. And so so that worked out very well as well. And here's the trailer. Yep. So as you can see, we also have like another character that features in that in the art is Dakota, and that was also something different that we tried out, to have one strong character in addition to our primary character. We also expanded on the character of Kadir, for example. That was another character that was very well received by fans in Coteries, and we wanted to give him some more space to shine in Shadows as well. So to kind of summarize everything that happened, I already mentioned some of the challenges, but to recap, what we had to deal with was other than the fun that we had, basically, since most of us working on the project were familiar with Vampire the Masquerade in one way or another. Cross, for example, had his start with Bloodlines. Jacek, our business developer, and me played Vampire the Masquerade, the tabletop game, way back in the day, and I was very much into the lore of Vampire for years and years before, petering out a bit and then coming back in with my enthusiasm as we started this project. But other than the fun that we had and the excitement that we could share with people by creating something long-lasting in this franchise, where there were some challenges in addition to that. So one of them was definitely the fact that the Vampire the Masquerade of yesteryear that I was familiar with wasn't exactly the same as the 5th edition. The 5th edition kept a lot of the basic mechanics of the game and a lot of the basic ideas behind the setting, but it advanced the storyline in such a way that several things that I was used to weren't really around in the same way anymore. So, for example, the Sabbat, a third big faction, was basically moved away. We basically moved away from them, and the Anarchs took their place. So that was one big thing. For example, under Paradox, White Wolf also wanted to double down on vampires' more kind of humanistic, moralistic themes. So, for example, hunger was reworked a little bit and was made into a bigger part of the core mechanic that it used to be in the older editions. So all of that and a bit of a change in how the game presents itself, with a bigger focus on modified photographs and this kind of magazine style. That was also something we took into consideration, but in that case, we kind of kept to that concept art kind of style of art. And for the most part, it seems like people really enjoyed that. So we did have to learn some lessons, and other lessons we decided basically we would be able to not learn at that time. So stuff like art, for example. Although we did have to take into consideration that certain things that used to be a part of the course, like the aesthetics themselves, like the old editions had this gothic punk feeling about them, but that was very 90s, and both aesthetically and musically we had to figure out what a modern vampire could look and sound like, and that was a part of the challenge as well. Secondly, which might not be readily obvious, but since we're a Polish company, we don't really have all that much knowledge about New York. New York City seems to be this place that everybody knows something about. We've seen the city in movies, in video games, in what have you, for years and years and years, and it seems like it's a very well-known place. But that's only the surface level impression. What's actually true is that it's a very complex city. It's one of the biggest cities in the world. It comprises of 5 boroughs, and each borough has a different character to it. It's a multiracial, multicultural city, extremely multicultural city, and so we couldn't really capture the entirety of the city in a single game. I don't think even a very big AAA production could do that. And so we need to focus on like pockets of interest to make the city feel, the city that as we presented in the game, feel authentic, but at the same time still recognizable as New York. And since our scope of the game was smaller, we also wanted to still give people the impression that they are wandering around this particular big city and not just any other small town or whatever. And that was kind of a challenge, since we had like very localized quests, and the writing can do a lot of things, but it's kind of tricky to give you an idea of size and scope of the place that you're traveling if all you have is writing and some background images. We did have some help. We had a friend who made some photos for us on location. We had a list of interesting locations, and he also came up with a few excellent suggestions as to which locations could be visited to feature in the game. So we had that help, and that was very useful. But other than that, it was kind of tricky. And personally, it seems to me like the best idea is to base stuff either in the fantasy realm, when you can basically create the world from the ground up, or else in a place that you are really, really familiar with. So the World of Darkness itself was kind of a challenge, just because the World of Darkness as it is now is going through a transition, basically, since Paradox has taken the rights and they have focused on giving this license to people who know what to do with it. The World of Darkness is kind of being remade in a way. So all those different IPs that I've told you about at the beginning that were popular in the 90s, stuff like Mage and Werewolf and Wraith, etc., all of that stuff is still being worked on. And so basically we were lucky that we worked with Vampire, because Vampire was mostly figured out, and there were only some smaller things that we had to basically negotiate with Paradox, or wait a little bit until they have a better idea of what something should of how something should work like. And so it was kind of challenging that we weren't sure that we are on stable ground at times. But on the whole, I have to say that in general, which is this other thing, working with Paradox was like 9 times out of 10, it was a really good experience, and we seem to be very familiar in terms of I kind of have a good understanding of what they want to do with their franchises, with Vampire, especially since that's the one I'm most familiar with. And so nine times out of 10, we would very quickly sync on stuff that we needed to do. And from time to time, we did spend some time negotiating things which didn't come to fruition, or else they did come to fruition, but not exactly in the way that we thought would work. But that's the thing when you're working with a licensor. In the end, the licensor has the final say. And I think that was also Even though it was challenging at times, that was also like a very cool perspective for us as a studio, since this was the first time when we were working with an established IP. And it was all in all, it was a pretty good experience. And so obviously, like, other than making your teenage dreams come true by working on a franchise that you were a fan of when you were, like, 17, 18, 19, etc., or early 20s, it was also like a very good learning experience. And I think that's mostly all that I had for you guys, and I'll be happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you very much for your talk. So as for questions, we have one for now in our chat. Vitaly asks about engines that you used for your games.
Mm-hmm. All right. So in this case, we use Unity. As a company, we tend to work in Unity. We are best familiar with that engine. But we had to use a few plugins. One in particular was Dialogue System by Pixel Crushers, and that was what we created the heart of the game, all the dialogues, etc., using that tool as a plugin. Other than that, a lot of custom stuff, as you usually do with Unity. And basically, it's a game that could have been made in another simpler engine perhaps, but since we were familiar with that one, we decided we would just keep going with it, and in the end, it was especially useful when we started porting, since Unity has that feature that it's basically, after you learn how to do it once, and we did already several times before, the porting process is pretty easy, all things considered.
Okay, thank you. Another question. As I understood, you initially had like one scope, and after that you had to cut it. So you told that you initially wanted to make a game about 7 clients, and after that you cut it before you started work, or after that.
Yes. So depending on, like, pre-production is tricky because it's very easy to. I mean, it's kind of hard to guess if anything that you create in pre-production is going to make it to the final game, right? So sometimes you could say that you've worked on something for longer than you actually did. Like in this case, we created the proof of concept demo in 2 months, and that was before we officially knew we were going to make the game. But some stuff from that proof of concept demo obviously made its way further into the game. And so you could say we made the cuts very early, because we did find out early that creating like 7 playable clans, all with their own disciplines, and with some clans which are particularly tricky, like the Nosferatu and the Malkavians, who usually require a bit of a special treatment because they have certain rules that work differently for them. We would have to like create either a very small game or a very shallow game. And so what we decided to do instead is early on, seeing how much time the proof of concept demo took, and how much content we managed to put into that, we already knew, okay, well, before we even start doing this thing for real, we really have to make this a smaller game. So in a way, like, if you're asking if we had to throw anything out, not really. We didn't really have anything written for those other 4 characters that we were considering adding. But we initially, like, that was also because the mixer pitch that we created included those 7 characters, and so that was kind of something that we inherited from that original pitch into the second one. That felt like it's going to be easy to do, but then when we realized, okay, no, actually our focus is going to be such that creating all 7 characters would be at the service of the game, that's when we decided to cut it.
Okay, I think that you actually did it in a really like good time, in perfect time for doing it, because it's I saw quite often when it happens like later on later stages, and it causes like much more issues in development.
And for Coteries we had to make a few cuts here and there, but I tried to always make them in such a way that we didn't have to throw anything out. So basically, I always cut preemptively before we before we had any content that would have to be thrown out. We just some details of the plot changed, maybe like stuff like that. But other than that, what you see in the final product is basically everything that's been fully written for that game.
Okay. We have another question in chat. I'm not sure that I understood what it's about, but I will ask you, maybe you will understand. So, was it hard to promote these games considering a completely different genre compared to its PC predecessors?
Yeah. So basically, the question, as I understand it, is whether it was difficult to promote Coteries, given that the previous game was an RPG. The previous game in the franchise, the previous Vampire the Masquerade game, was Bloodlines, and it was an RPG.
Okay.
Yeah, and it kind of was, though we were kind of lucky that Bloodlines 2 got delayed, and not even once but twice during our creation of the game, because the first delay meant that we would be the first Vampire the Masquerade game that would be readily available since Bloodlines, and people were really fans of Bloodlines and fans of Vampire the Masquerade were really interested in getting one of these games, even if it's not exactly an RPG. So in that way, that was kind of useful for us, even though we were a different genre. People were happy to receive a new Vampire the Masquerade game. And then with Shadows, because Bloodlines was pushed again, we managed to even do that twice. We managed to put out 2 games in the World of Darkness setting before, not before any other game, because I believe Werewolf Heart of the Forest, beat Shadows to the punch by a week or something like that. But for Vampire the Masquerade, we managed to create 2 games before Bloodlines 2 came out and before any other Vampire the Masquerade game came out. But there was a lot of criticism from people who were expecting an RPG, and they were disappointed that the game is just a visual novel and it's just reading and no like dice rolls or no mechanics of the sort that you would maybe expect from a game like that. So definitely there was some backlash, but I would say that for the most part, like, people who were meant to get it got it in that way. So people who were expecting a lighter story-driven thing were happy with the final product for the most part.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned that you said such a phrase like "we didn't work during the weekend like yet" or at the time, something like that. So does it mean that you had some kind of crunch after that?
Yeah. So we did do me especially, but a few other people as well. Did overtime in like October, November for Coteries, especially. And yeah, it was a lot of additional work, but basically it was down to the fact that we just didn't want to cut the game's scope any further. So we had the option to cut out content, but instead we decided, okay, so let's get another writer. That's when Johanna Pettersson came on board, to get another writer to write some of the content, and then to also get some people who were just finishing up Ritual Crown of Horns at the time, our other game that came out around the same time as Coteries did, and get them on board to help us with testing and help us with brushing up the UI and stuff like that. So we did have some crunch during Coteries, but like, fortunately in our company, it always means that you're gonna get you are going to get enumerated for your work, so you will get paid for that overtime, or you will be able to take free time later down the road. And so I wouldn't recommend it, obviously. Like, it's not the best way to create a game, but in the case of Coteries, we would have to keep pushing the release window And that was also something that kind of happened. We already did actually push the release window twice, but we did it before announcing the date. So that was another kind of cut or change that we didn't quite announce to people. But yeah, it was kind of tough. Fortunately for Shadows, because we had most of the stuff figured out, we already knew how to make a game like this. We already had a very good pipeline for art and for implementation and everything. So we were able to, for the most part, avoid crunching in Shadows.
Okay, thank you very much. So you're working now on sequel of the serial Cleaner, right?
Yep.
Yeah, because that's actually was the game that I played and why I knew your studio because of it. It's quite nice. Okay, thank you very much. I wish you all the best with your next projects.
Thank you.
Hope you will back to the Games Gathering conference and tell us more about your future projects.
Hopefully next year.
Nice. Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks a lot, guys.